Good morning. Welcome to Teddy Talks for Thursday, April 16th, 2020. I'm Joe Wiegand, coming to you from Medora, North Dakota, gateway to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, the place where the Northern Pacific Railroad crossed the Little Missouri in 1883, and a young Theodore Roosevelt came out to hunt a bison bull, purchased some cattle before returning to New York City and his duties in Albany, New York as a young New York General Assemblyman, and would be a cattle rancher here, 1884, 85, 86, terrible winter of 86, 87, taking most of the herd, most of his investment. But he said that this is where the romance of his life began. Here at Teddy Talks, we salute history. Theodore Roosevelt wrote history himself, his Winning of the West in 4 parts, a wonderful addition to our history catalog. So much of what he wrote about his adventurous life here in the West, in Africa, and in South America, amongst some of the wonderful histories that Theodore Roosevelt has left to us. And in 1912, also Theodore Roosevelt was elected president of the American Historical Association, and we may review some of his writings with regards to the discipline of studying history. Today in history, on this date in 1859, the death of Alexis de Tocqueville. You'll often hear of de Tocqueville or Tocqueville with regards to his Democracy in America, a 2-volume set of his observations, often considered seminal in the fields of sociology and political science. His review of our young democracy, very insightful and inspiring in so many ways. In 1867, on April 16th, 1867, that was the birth of Wilbur Wright, half of the Wright brothers team, famous now in Dayton, Ohio. He born in Millville, Indiana on this date. He died in 1912, but in 1908 and 1909, the Wright brothers had sold 2 planes to the War Department under Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, and it was Wilbur's brother Orville. I think Wilbur might have been in France at the time, negotiating sales of Wright flyers to the French and other governments in Europe. And it was Orville who crashed at an air demonstration at Fort Myer, and it was Lieutenant Selfridge that was killed, the first passenger fatality in an airplane accident. In 1881, on this date, April 16th, in Dodge City, Kansas, Sheriff Bat Masterson had his fights in his last gun battle as the sheriff of Dodge City, Kansas at the time. Theodore Roosevelt, during his presidency, would appoint Bat Masterson to the federal position of U.S. Marshal for the Southern District of New York. In writing Mr. Masterson, a famed gambler and a man who frequented prize fights and would write for the New York newspapers on prize fighting, in 1905, Roosevelt wrote Masterson a letter in which he concluded with the lines, quote, "You must be careful not to gamble or do anything while you are a public officer which might afford opportunity to your enemies and my critics to say that your appointment was improper." $2,000 a year, equivalent to some $56,000 today, to be a Southern District of New York, United States Marshal. On this date in 1889, the birth of Charlie Chaplin, the British actor and comedian, born in London, England. And while he would have been a young entertainer and performer, perhaps some of his movies or vaudeville New York performances being seen by the president. The reason I like to include Chaplin here is that his World War II movie, The Dictator, probably one of the finest pieces of anti-Nazi propaganda produced in the Second World War, the year of the Second World War. So if you are indeed running out of movies to see on your Netflix at home during these times, you'll be inspired by and entertained by the wit of Charlie Chaplin. On this date in 1902, by presidential proclamation, which could be done under the under the rules of the Forest Reserve Act. President Theodore Roosevelt could declare national forests from amongst federal lands, and did so on this date in Nebraska, declaring both the Niobrara and the Dismal River forest reserves in Nebraska, both of those forests. And on this date in 1915, the death of Senator Nelson W. Aldrich of Rhode Island. In most cases, this Republican stalwart was an opponent of Theodore Roosevelt in the United States Senate, and I'm sure that we'll have an opportunity to discuss a bit more about the relationship between those two great figures, Theodore Roosevelt and Senator Aldrich, during the weeks ahead. Today, the highlight of our readings today is a presidential proclamation number 804, and this was issued by Theodore Roosevelt on this date, April 16th, 1908. It established Natural Bridges National Monument as Utah's first national monument. A brief reading. By the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. Whereas a number of natural bridges situated in southeastern Utah, having heights more lofty and spans far greater than any heretofore known to exist, are of the greatest scientific interest, and it appears that the public interests would be promoted by reserving these extraordinary examples of stream erosion with as much land as may be necessary for the proper protection thereof. Now, therefore, I, Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States of America, by virtue of the power invested in by Section 2 of the Act of Congress, approved June 8, 1906, entitled An Act for the Preservation of American Antiquities, do hereby set aside as the Natural Bridges National Monument, subject to any valid interest or rights, at and surrounding each of the natural bridges located on the White Canyon and tributaries in San Juan County, state of Utah, by common report named by Horace J. Long as Augusta Bridge, Caroline Bridge, and Little Bridge, 40 acres in square form with sidelines running north and south and east and west, equidistant from the respective centers of said bridges. Warning is hereby expressly given to all unauthorized persons not to appropriate, injure, or destroy any of the natural bridges hereby declared to be a national monument, nor to locate or settle upon any of the lands reserved and made a part of said monument by this proclamation. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States to be affixed. Done at the city of Washington, the 16th day of April, in the year of our Lord 1908, and of the independence of the United States the 132nd, Theodore Roosevelt. By the President, witnessed by Robert Bacon, Acting Secretary of State. A Harvard, not classmate, not graduating in the same year, I believe, but Robert Bacon, part of the Harvard team in the Roosevelt White House. I don't have record of Theodore Roosevelt visiting any of the bridges named here, popular names Augusta Bridge, Caroline Bridge, Little Bridge. But in 1913, prior to his adventure in Brazil, former President Theodore Roosevelt, the country would refer to Colonel Roosevelt, he made a trip to Arizona and to the Grand Canyon. He had along with him the youngest of his sons, both Archie and Quentin, along. A long adventure, a lot of horse riding. And John Wetherill, a man famous in the Navajo region of northern Arizona and southern Utah, would guide on horseback and mule train the Roosevelts out to Rainbow Bridge. Rainbow Bridge would be declared a national monument in 1910 by President Taft. And in 1913, the Roosevelt clan took quite an arduous trip on horseback. Today, visitors to Rainbow Bridge visit by going on a boat on Lake Powell. It takes you to just a short hike away from Rainbow Bridge, and much less arduous than what I think was a get in shape for Brazil trip for the former president. Some of Harvey Leake is the great grandson of John Wetherell. If you'd like to see some of the books that Harvey Leake has written about his grandfather and grandmother's adventures, those are available, I'm sure. Send me a note if you'd be more interested. I've had a wonderful visit with Mr. Leake about his grandparents and the role that they played in taking the Roosevelts out. So if I may, we'll conclude with a little reading about Theodore Roosevelt's time here in Medora. To answer for those that haven't been here since its inception, maybe the question comes up, why Teddy Talks, why Medora, North Dakota? Teddy Talks comes from the idea that in addition to being inspired and entertained by performances in character as Theodore Roosevelt, which I hope my audiences are, those are entertainments done in the spirit of, say, Hal Holbrook doing Mark Twain, or James Whitmore performing as Will Rogers, or Harry Truman. It's an entertainment with a lot of history in there, but a good deal of storytelling. When we are able to, in Teddy Talks, get to some of the original documents, the original speeches and writings, excerpts of Theodore Roosevelt in his own words which often don't translate easily into a stage performance, but readings that in this format, hopefully either here at our live engagements or later in a podcast format on YouTube or Spotify, with thanks to my friends at the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation for putting Teddy Talks in those formats. To hear him in his own words is quite an inspiring thing for me, and I hope instructive or inspiring for some of you there. Theodore Roosevelt in that year, 1913, also published his autobiography. And in that autobiography, he writes of his life all the way from a childhood in New York City to his adventures up to that date, including the 1912 campaign. But he writes about his coming to the Badlands of what was then Dakota Territory, North and South Dakota being one territory at the time, statehood coming in 1889. But when he arrives in 1883 and 84, this is the frontier with regards to the fact that this had been passed over when settlement occurred to the west, and great farms and ranches were springing up to the west. These Badlands were left unoccupied till the cattle ranchers followed the voyageurs and the fur trappers in this region, the buffalo hunters most especially. But I thought we'd conclude today with, since we're so brief with the presidential proclamation, on days when we're very brief, I'll add a little bit of answering that question, why Medora? The place, by the way, where we have the nation's only national park named for an individual, Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and a place where we are going to build the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. And more about that wonderful program led by the state of North Dakota and Governor Burgum on future programs. But this maybe just to whet your appetite for a little bit more about Medora and the Badlands and the Little Missouri and the ranch life here, the land that Theodore Roosevelt said, had it not been for his experiences here, he would have never been president. So from chapter 4 of the autobiography, In Cowboy Land, just a reading of the first page, if I may, to answer that question, why Medora? Though I had previously made a trip into the then territory of Dakota beyond the Red River, it was not until 1883 that I went to the Little Missouri and there took hold of 2 cattle ranches, the Chimney Butte and the Elkhorn. It was still the Wild West in those days, the far West, the West of Owen Wister's stories and Frederick Remington's drawings, the West of the Indian and the buffalo hunter, the soldier and the cowpuncher. That land of the West has gone now, gone with lost Atlantis, gone to the Isle of Ghosts and of strange dead memories. It was a land of vast silent spaces, of lonely rivers, and of plains where the wild game stared at the passing horsemen. It was a land of scattered ranches, of herds of long-horned cattle, and of reckless riders who, unmoved, looked in the eyes of life or of death. In that land we led a free and hardy life, with horse and with rifle. We worked under the scorching midsummer sun when the wide plains shimmered and wavered in the heat. And we knew the freezing misery of riding night guard round the cattle in the late fall roundup. In the soft springtime, the stars were glorious in our eyes each night before we fell asleep. And in the winter, we rode through blinding blizzards when the driven snow dust burnt our faces. There were monotonous days as we guided the trail cattle of the beef herds hour after hour at the slowest of walks, and minutes or hours teeming with excitement as we stopped stampedes or swam the herds across rivers treacherous with quicksands or brimmed with running ice. We knew toil and hardship and hunger and thirst. We saw men die violent deaths as they worked among the horses and cattle or fought in evil feuds with one another. But we felt the beat of hardy life in our veins, and ours was the glory of work and the joy of living. Well, indeed, we're here in Medora because we feel it, and we hope you'll feel it. The beat of hearty life in our veins, the glory of work, and the joy of living. When you're ready, we'll be here in Medora for a wonderful summer of enjoyable activities and explorations in Theodore Roosevelt National Park. We have 2 more programs this week, Friday and Saturday on Teddy Talks. Tomorrow, Friday, April 17th, we'll have a message from Theodore Roosevelt at the White House to the Commercial Club of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a new state at that point, and Theodore Roosevelt speaking to the issue of the treatment of the Indians of Oklahoma, the Native American community, and the feeling of responsibility Theodore Roosevelt felt as president. And then on Saturday, April 18th, the 114th anniversary of the great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. We'll focus on Theodore Roosevelt's federal response, the use of the United States Army and Navy in securing the safety and welfare of the people of the greater San Francisco region, and also Theodore Roosevelt's opposition to the machine politicians of San Francisco, who, through their malfeasance, left the people of San Francisco vulnerable before and suffering during and after the San Francisco earthquake. So that's it for Teddy Talks today. Thank you for being with us. Stay safe, stay well, stay home. And for those that aren't staying home, those that are driving the trucks and working at the hospitals, to the nurses and doctors, to all of our law enforcement, park rangers, to everyone, stay safe, and we'll see you here tomorrow on Teddy Talks. Bully. Have a great day.